Hi, my name is Pilar Alderete, and I'm here from the National University of Ireland with my colleague Owen Harrington-Fernández from Heriot-Watt University in the UK. We're going to talk a little bit about, well, we're going to question the need for a sociolinguistic training for children literature translators. And we're going to talk about some research that we've been working on with the series, the book series Manolito Gafotas by Elvira Lindo. Together, we've also formed the Children in Translation Network, which at the moment, and if you're interested, is having a series of webinars. You can see there the program, monthly webinars, and the next speaker is going to be Professor Sohar Shavit on the 24th of November. If you need this information or the link, indeed, you can email us to childrenintranslationnetwork@gmail.com. And without further ado, I will go on to our presentation. So, as you can see, we have been working on the three books, the translation of the three first books of the series, Manolito Gafotas, which has been translated to 45 languages. And we've been looking at the American English translations that have been offered by different publishing companies. We were doing descriptive analysis, basically, that you can see in the publication that you see up above here. And basically, we reached the same conclusions that Emer O'Sullivan reaches in her comparative children literature book, in which a lot of the physical violence, substance abuse, physicality and prudery, conflict with linguistic forms, national and political reference, insults, death, taboo words and slang are purified or censored and get rid of directly. And that'll be in the books. In the last few months, we've been looking at the film series, which two other films have been subtitled, both of them, and one of them dubbed. You can see in bold some of the examples I have from the dubbing, and in italics, you can see some of the examples I have for the subtitles. Obviously, physical violence is quite difficult to censor on a audiovisual media because you can actually see it. So that's one of the first things that we see there, whereas in the books, it had been substituted by lecturing or chewing out or things like that. The substance abuse as well, they kept it, whereas in the books, they use an addiction to Coca-Cola. You can see lots of the references to eschatological jokes or anything like that. They kept the conflict with linguistic forms. You can see the misspelling of diarrhea, both in Spanish and English. Even though one of the comic characters you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, which is Swedish, in Spanish sounds fairly wrong or with a lot of mistakes, whereas in the English it produced quite correct English. So they did not do that. They were not coherent with the practice in that instance. You can see that Jihad, which is obviously a problematic character, this is his nickname to translate, was kept, and in the dubbing he was called Ali. The insults were kept, and the references to death were kept, and the same with the slang. We should add that they translated into a Central American variation, and there was no main other geographical variations in the film. So there's definitely a different practice. It's worth noticing that the film series were published before the books, but you can see there's different approaches to the way characters and speech were translated in both. So this is it. Like our whole research basically led us this way into questioning how identities in children books and adult books, identities of children and identities in general, are translated. We're specifically worried about children literature because of all these moral correctness and moral corrections even done in the books. So our main question is, do we need to have some kind of sociolinguistic training in order to do with these characters or character voice that comes through in order to translate character as a unit of meaning? Or are we just going to rely on the typical, he has a keen ear for character or something like that?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is moving on from the textual analysis that Pilar was just talking about, especially about the books, where we identified that there was censorship, that censorship was guided by a sphere of values in the target culture that made a decision that the values in the original were not acceptable or were not appropriate for the translation into American English. And we weren't the only ones to identify that censorship either. We weren't the only ones to look at this particular case study and reach the conclusion that that the censorship of the book really went overboard or was excessive. But we wanted to go further than that. We wanted to move on. We didn't just want to say, well, there's content in this book that isn't in the translation, and you just leave it there. We didn't want to leave it in a vacuum. We wanted to ask the question, well, what are the real life consequences of this kind of manipulation, this kind of adaptation, or this kind of censorship, whatever word you want to use to describe it. And that's when we came upon the idea of setting up translation or setting up reading for children and for adults as well, but specifically focused on children here, setting it up as a conversation, right? And this is not a new idea in literature. We've had a lot of different versions of reader response frameworks, but we wanted to ask we wanted to put together a framework that didn't just focus on meaning, but actually placed identity at the forefront of its thinking. So we thought real readers interact with the text. What we want to say is that real readers have a conversation with a text, and in that conversation, in that interaction, identities emerge in discourse. So we know that the real reader is going to be in the listener position in our conventional conversational binary, but who is speaking, who is creating meaning, who is the person that is constantly saying something, as it were, during the reading process. And that's where we borrow from literary theory, and we came across the real reader versus the implied reader, and the implied reader being that fictive image, that fictive abstraction that is embedded in the discourse of a book. Anything to do with clues that you find in the narrative, such as sense of humor, references to popular culture, language use. Anybody who shares those particular discourses could be argued as an implied reader of the text. And when we take Manolito Gafotas, that's a case study that actually lends itself very well to this idea, to exploring the idea of implied readers and implied narrators, because there are a number of voices in the book. There's a study by Salstad, who's quoted in the slide there, who identifies that there are 3 different implied narrators in Manolito Gafotas. So there's the implied narrator that addresses the child reader, there's the implied narrator that addresses a teenage reader, and there's the implied narrator who addresses the adult reader. This was an idea that came out of the fact that the proof is in the pudding with Manolito Gafotas. It was a book that was widely read throughout all ages, and that's reflected in the sales as well. It wasn't just read by children, it was read by teenagers, and it was read by adults. And identifying these 3 implied narrators was a way of answering the question, why was it so popular with everybody? And that's something that in the translation hasn't been reflected. We have basically an attenuation of voices, or a silencing of voices in the translation. So if we look at this particular framework that we borrow from O'Sullivan, we wanted to ask, what happens then when a translator is inserted into this sort of hermeneutic continuum? We have these orders of intentionality in the original book, where the author creates a number of voices in the text that create an abstraction of an implied reader and implied narrator. How does the introduction of a translator and an implied translator in the text influence those voices or that communication that's taking place in the book? And we didn't want to just ask, the typical binaries that you get with translation studies, the covert versus overt, foreignization or domestication, adequation or acceptability. We wanted to include in this framework the possibility of asking questions about the translator's role in this particular framework, whether it's iterative, whether it's disruptive, or whether the translation has been a constructive influence in terms of discourse in the translation of the books. And this is where we came to make the decision then that if we're going to shape or if we're going to frame reading children's literature or literature, any literature in translation, as a conversation, we want a framework that will help us describe what happens in that reading process as if it were a conversation. And we borrowed Bucholtz and Hall's 5 identity principles. We've adapted them slightly to, to make sure that they fit or the purpose that we're hoping to bring to bear on the study. It has 5 different principles. I'm not going to dwell too long on most of them. The emergence principle, positionality principle, I will talk a little bit about in a second. Partialness, indexicality, and relationality. The central tenet of all these principles is that identity is intersubjective, right? So, identity is something that emerges when 2 entities enter into conversation or into dialogue. And, in layman's terms, identity, it takes 2 to tango. You can put it that way. So with the relationality principle, which is the one that I want to focus on today, that's really based on sort of intersubjective strategies, as Bucholtz and Hall call it. And we're focusing on the 3 that they describe, which is adequation versus distinction, authentication versus denaturalization, and it was authorization, authorization and delegitimization, right? So the first one, adapted to translation, these 3 principles could work in our analysis in this way. So adequation versus distinction is very similar to the kind of binary or the kind of axis that you see in social studies around identity. Sameness versus difference. We act in a way that makes us the same to a particular group, or we act in a way that makes us different to a particular group. Adequation versus distinction works in the same way or in very similar ways in this framework. Adapted to translation, we can say that the translator has to make decisions about whether to make the characters the same as the characters in the source text or different to the characters in the source text, adequating them in a way, adapting them to the target culture. Depending on that, on which of these the translation decisions fall, we can then make a judgment as to whether the translation method denaturalizes or authenticates an identity. So an authentic identity is one that resonates within the discourse of the narrative. One that's denaturalized is one that doesn't resonate, that is the product of artifice or of lying or of being unfaithful, bringing that idea of fidelity into translation studies again. And depending again on which of those 2 poles the translation method falls, you could make a decision as to whether the translation itself authorizes an identity in the target culture or delegitimizes it in the target culture. To make a long story short, in Manolito Gafotas, when we apply this framework, we can come to the conclusion that the translation has delegitimized the identities that resonate freely and that are perfectly appropriate in the source culture in Spain. And that's really down to positionality. It's really down to the assumptions that we make as adults about the positionality of the readers. So if we move to the next, slide. So foreignness, the idea of foreignness, which is a relative concept. If something is foreign, it really depends on how you position yourself in relation to that object. And as adults that choose the books that are translated, as adults that translate the books, that edit the books, and that pick up the books in bookshops that we want our children to read, we make certain assumptions about how unnecessary, especially when we're talking about translations into English, we make assumptions about how unnecessary it is for our children to encounter something that's foreign, that it's going to affect or inhibit the reading process, when actually there's plenty of studies that show that that is not the case, that if children encounter something foreign, in the same way that if they encounter something that they don't understand, it's no great tragedy. They just skip it and keep on reading. There's no problem with it. So that's something that we do create the framework neutral in a way that allows for the description of whatever translation decisions have taken place during the translation process. But one of the things that we do want to achieve with our framework is to break down this myth that we should avoid children reading something that is foreign, because that's essentially what's happened in the Manolito Gafotas book. All the readers of the translation of Manolito Gafotas have been denied the opportunity to enter into a dialogue with a voice. And that is really the conclusion of the entire analysis, that the publishing house in the United States has made a decision which is tantamount to an intellectual colonization of a book that is perfectly fine in Spain, that has been very successful and celebrated in Spain as something that is representative of the culture and of the time. And the United States, Mark Cavendish Publishing House, and Amazon, who later took on the book and sold it on its platform, are basically saying that might be good enough for Spanish children, but it's not good enough for English-speaking children, and especially for American children.
Yeah. Just to add to that, for a second to add to that, like it is not even like, I'm thinking, for example, about the examples we've given about the grandfather, which is not a child's voice. It basically, the way the grandfather issues have been cleaned up, it almost reflects a need to filter reality that like has been very popular in children literature. So sometimes it's not even a decision of a translator. We're not trying to blame any translators or anything like that. We're trying to find ways of solve some issues that may arise in the way that a reader in different cultures may approach a foreign book, because in the end it's a foreign book, and what do they want to gain from it. And to finish up, we just want to give us our details in case you want to ask us any questions or you want to keep in touch with our research. Again, to remind you that we have the online webinars all for you. If you want to join us, you're welcome. You just need to send us an email and I'll register you for them. Thank you.
Maybe I can ask you about, have you thought about distinguishing big languages and big cultures, and the question of domination, and this principle that the smaller languages and cultures are to embrace the other? Well,
yeah, you are correct. In fact, Manolito has been translated to 45 languages, and one of the translations that has been best received by the readership has been the Irani one, okay, and Japanese as well. You could say that sometimes it's not just the fact that they're smaller or less, because Japanese couldn't be a small language, but it could also be the closeness of certain parameters in the culture of Spain, or Manolito is beyond the Spanish, because it's actually a lower working class group of people in Madrid, and that probably supported the kind of censorship, brutal censorship in some of the American English translations, because we were trying to eliminate not so much the Spanish culture, but this specific problematic for them culture. There's a question in the chat.
Yeah, there is a question. So, why do you think that translated children's literature into English tends to be reluctant to the foreign element?
You're muted. Oh.
I'm muted. Yeah, I'm muted. I think the real question, the question that you can ask before you ask that question, is why do we treat culture as an object rather than a process or a performance? Because anything that's foreign is objectifying something that's not familiar to you. So I think the question is, why don't we allow readers to engage with identities, with something we would call foreign, in a dynamic process that creates meaning in discourse, rather than instilling a sort of ethos of cultural literacy. It gets very political when you start mentioning cultural literacy, but cultural literacy, like with the type that we've seen in the United States and in UK education, that objectifies culture and says these are the 20 things that you need to know to be a good UK citizen, or these are the 20 things that you need to know to be a good United States citizen. That objectifies culture to the point where it alienates anything that's not in that system. So I think that's the answer to why something that's foreign, something like a grandfather sharing a bed with his grandchild in quite a sweet moment in Manolito Gafotas, is removed in the American English translation because it objectifies that as something that wouldn't take place or something that is completely inappropriate in the United States. And by removing that element, you're not allowing the reader of the American version to position themselves in relation to that event and to the identities that are embedded in the narrative.
I also want to add something that Owen and I have been discussing lately, because one of the things that we enjoy about this research is that we bounce ideas against each other, is the issue of culture as like socio-cultural. So it's not so, again, it's not so much a foreign as foreign country, it's the foreign as anything that is foreign. And there's two things there. First of all, children literature in the world is sometimes cleaned up of foreign elements or more localized or more domesticated or whatever term you want to inject, because we assume they're not we're thinking of a level of comprehension, therefore they don't have experience. We do a generalization, like the idea of the implied reader. But the other issue there that you're talking about is market forces, okay, which we've mentioned briefly. One of the first things that features in the Manolito translations that we talked at the beginning is that they started being commanded by Amazon. So what can I tell you about Amazon publishing editors now? So there's other things there that are not just English or American. It's also the publishing company, the marketing milieu that you're working in, what English you're translating into, because sometimes translations into British English by Penguin or others, or smaller even, will have this element in a different way, done in a different way, not so much adapting it and hiding it, which is, I guess our concern is the hiding, the fact that we're not exposing children to a variety of things or a variety of ways of being as a child.
Can I just add as well to that? It's very difficult for me to make the argument that we're that we're neutral in this debate, because clearly we're not. But we have hopefully the idea that the framework borrows from literary theory, borrows from sociolinguistics, and is framed within translation studies. It's really just a mechanism to describe what happens in translation rather than offer a set of guidelines or be prescriptive about the way something should be translated. And that addresses the power imbalance that was mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. That bringing the framework to bear on a textual analysis will reveal the kind of power imbalances that are behind certain translation decisions, the kind of decisions that Pilar was just talking about.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. And I think this is a really very important topic. We could discuss about it for a long time, and maybe a whole panel could be dedicated, of course. But now I think that we should move on. Next speaker, thank you very much once again.
And we're both going to apologize because we have to run to a class, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.